He's bearded, he's violent, and he's a problem.
I owe you an apology. You begged for me to let you die.
Hi, I'm LadyJenevia, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. Today's review is of a new period piece thriller called The Death of Robin Hood. Robin Hood is a character largely known as heroic. He robs the rich to give to the poor. He's often depicted as wearing green and being skilled in archery as well as being able to fight with a sword. However, this is a considerably darker take on the character. The film's premise reads: grappling with his past after a life of crime and murder, Robin Hood finds himself gravely injured after a battle he thought would be his last. In the hands of a mysterious woman, he is offered a chance at salvation. The film opens with full-on brutality. You are introduced to this new version of Robin Hood, who is still an outlaw, but he's a bandit who enacts horrific violence. The lore that we as the audience know does exist to a certain extent in this film, but it's just a story as opposed to an accurate reflection of the man himself. It's pretty relentless to sit through the first portion of the film. The action is very impressive and highly visceral, but it could also be overwhelming depending on the viewer. That being said, I would argue that even if the opening portion of the film is difficult to watch, it's worth it to experience what comes after. He gets badly injured, and his companion, Little John, played by Bill Skarsgård, brings him to some sort of a safe haven or a sanctuary. I don't remember the word they used to describe it in the film, but this is where we meet Sister Bridget, played by my absolute favorite, Jodie Comer. I knew I wanted to review The Death of Robin Hood as soon as I knew it involved Jodie Comer being in a period piece again, because no matter how the film would turn out, it would give me an excuse to tell all of you to support Ridley Scott's The Last Duel. Jodie Comer was phenomenal in this, a very underrated film.
My fate and our child's fate will be written not by God's will, but by which old man will tire first.
Bridget is a healer. She oversees this place and looks after things. Once she gets to work on helping Robin Hood's injuries, this is where we get to experience what this film is really all about. It's not about the violence, action, outlaw shenanigans. What this film ultimately is, once you get past that blood-stained opening act, this is a thoughtful deconstruction of the lasting ramifications of senseless violence. Set in a marvelously scenic backdrop of an ancient time, showcasing exceptional performances, it's a must-watch for cinephiles. This story is set in 1247, and the visual world building to believably convey the older time period is masterfully done. You have these scenic locations of nature, the costumes, props. I was fully transported. Given how far back the story is set, I considered this aspect quite a bit in trying to understand the characters and their lived experiences and material conditions that shape their perspectives. I was primed to do this because of the fact that earlier this year I was reading some books on Joan of Arc as research because one of my favorites, Baz Luhrmann, is doing a movie about her. Joan of Arc lived in the 1400s though, so it's not a one-to-one comparison, but her history being as far back in time as it is made it to where I was struggling to try to make sense of certain aspects of how and why she would think or behave. I had to give a lot of consideration to so many facets of her life and the history that shaped how she and the people around her lived. Now, The Death of Robin Hood is not a history book, nor is it a historical film. It's a work of fiction. That being said, this cognitive exercise helped me to consider the blank spaces of what isn't shown or explained about this world in the film, and the time period, and how that might impact the characters, especially this version of Robin Hood. The vicious brutality of the opening act in the context of the film as a whole feels like it's representative of what it's like to be caught up in a cycle of violence with no opportunity for reprieve. How would people in that location, in that time period, fulfill their most basic needs of obtaining things like food, water, and shelter? One option might be to relentlessly violently fight. Take, with a might is right approach to life. The consequences of a lifetime of doing this is that Robin Hood and Little John are regularly pursued by people who are related to previous people whom the pair have killed. Thus, the violence escalates exponentially. They're constantly having to run away from those that might try to get vengeance. Whether those folks are justified or not in that quest is besides the point. You can look at the story in isolation, simply as a gripping drama period piece, but if you like to analyze and interpret art in such a way that you extrapolate deeper meaning where you can find it, and relate that meaning to the lived experiences of the world as we know it today, as I've said before, there's something really thoughtful about how the film explores this idea of the lasting ramifications of senseless violence. The place that Robin Hood has his wounds tended to, the way of living there, is decidedly more harmonious. It's a different philosophy, the polar opposite of how Robin Hood and Little John have been living. Also, Little John only drops Robin Hood off here. He continues to go on the run after bringing Robin Hood there. The tone and pacing of the film completely changes once we are at this place. You'll have a lot of longer shots, you have a lot less volume in the context of sound. There's a stillness and softness that we have not seen before then. The opening act was violent, harsh, hot and cold in temperature. Everything was extreme. It is only when Robin Hood is forced to slow down that he has the chance to contemplate things in a way he seemingly never has before. The unrelenting pace of a violent life on the run have seemingly never given Robin Hood the space for self-reflection. Not to mention, this latest injury very nearly killed him. He's not a young man, and being faced with one's mortality is bound to make you consider your legacy, the impact you leave on the people in your most immediate circle, and whether or not there's a way to make things right as much as you can while you are still around to do so. The film doing this 180 after the first act was such that in the moment, while watching the film, being forced to sit in these longer, quieter moments made it to where I wasn't always sure what the film was aiming to do. I needed time after seeing it. I needed to sleep since I'm still very much grappling with jet lag. And only then did things start to fall into place in my mind of what the film was doing and how I understood and interpreted the material. I admire the artistry of this film. I also don't know how easy it is to pitch this film to people who are not already cinephiles, to people who want to see something more superficial and commercial in its approach. How does one relate this story to a 21st century understanding of life and the world at large? What is the window of empathy into a story like The Death of Robin Hood? Robin Hood is entrenched in violence. Everything about the way he lives his life, what he considers to be normal, the lack of regard he has for others, it's all about violence. There is no regard for how that violence impacts others, except when the ramifications of that violence directly boomerang back onto himself and Little John. If you squint, could that perhaps be reminiscent of the concept of the imperial boomerang? Now, it's not a one-to-one comparison. The Death of Robin Hood is not vast enough in its scale to involve international geopolitical conflicts. However, if you choose to analyze the art through that lens, I would argue that there is more you could do with that. Fundamentally, this way of living is not sustainable for Robin Hood or anyone. Presumably, Robin Hood and Little John were living that way, and it worked for them until it didn't. They reaped the rewards of violent pillaging until it came back to them. There were consequences to this indiscriminate violence. Jodie Comer, Sister Bridget, there is a point where she is giving Robin something to do. She asks him if he can hunt, which, of course, he can. She advises him on how many traps to set out, and the instructions are specific with the intention of making sure that although he will hunt in order to provide food for this small community, there is a limit he needs to follow so that it doesn't cause the population of the local wildlife to collapse. Thus, she and the community she is leading is comparatively more collectivistic and respecting the symbiotic relationship humanity should have with nature and its wildlife. She represents a philosophy and way of life that is constantly under attack, historically and today, by people who philosophically live and behave like Robin Hood in this movie, before he experiences that life-threatening injury. If you want to watch The Death of Robin Hood and simply view it as its own contained story, and not make any attempts to relate this story to us here and now in the 21st century, of course you can do that and still have plenty to admire, visually and narratively. It's a very compelling drama. However, without going into more of the specifics about some of the most memorable exchanges Robin Hood has with certain characters after he's been medically treated by Bridget, I found the story to be more interesting to consider and analyze when I did so through that lens. It was a means of finding a deeper connection to the material and characters than if it had just been this isolated story taking place almost 800 years ago. The film is really immersive and atmospheric. I loved the score. That was yet another way that it was effective in creating the time period and making it believable. In summary, I enjoyed it, particularly once we were out of that opening act, and it's a refreshing watch in a landscape of increasing corporatization of the arts.